Today, this is a new setup on my channel. It's going to be called Tangents, and I will be talking about certain subjects that gripe me and irritate me, certain propositions that people who dislike the Sam Raimi trilogy that they will bring up. So this is sort of play off of Drake's rant, Green Arrow rant, but today I'm going to talk about omnipresently everything about Sony, my likes, my dislikes. So let's get into it. So Spider-Man was first spearheaded back in 2002 with Sam Raimi, spearheaded by Sam Raimi. And if you're not familiar with Sam Raimi is a director but also passionate fan of Spider-Man. I believe one of his many renowned films was Evil Dead. And I've seen that film, and I was a bit surprised while watching it. But let's not get into that. But when he spearheaded Spider-Man, and he was a passionate fan, he knew he had fidelity for this source material back here. And that was a great thing. He knew how to mesh fidelity for the source material with a sense of novelty between, like, certain relationships between Mary Jane and Peter Parker that weren't as played out as they weren't in the comics. So what Sam Raimi did is he followed, he kind of played homage for Stan Lee and Ditko stuff back here, specifically like Spider-Man No More, issue 50, and even pulled that off with the whole look in Spider-Man 2, and that was sort of like the central theme about like that psychological struggle, and Peter struggling through that, having that psychological barrier, the inability to be Spider-Man because he lacks any motivation to be. Although it's a little strange, it's very difficult to read through the subtext of that, but that's basically what it is. It's a psychological barrier that inhibits him from being Spider-Man because he lacks any motivation or incentive. So I absolutely love Spider-Man 2. I think it's probably the most preeminent film out of all the Spider-Man films for me. And yeah, it's probably the definitive Spider-Man film, in my opinion. So once Raimi was getting along and everybody was doing him, praising his work of Spider-Man 2, and Spider-Man 3 was leading up to this huge grandeur finale of the trilogy, and it was exciting. So let's get into the greed of Sony and why Spider-Man 3 flopped. So if you knew about Spider-Man 3, if you know how they implemented so many antagonists, so many things happening, so convoluted, so inharmonious, the reason why is because Raimi wrote the script. Sorry, excuse me. He wrote the script, and he originally intended to have only one antagonist, and that is Sandman, Flint Marko. And the problem is that Sony, knowing that Raimi has a excellent track record with Spider-Man films so far and past films, they knew that they could push another antagonist and make bank. And they decided to they sort of forced it upon in the script for Raimi. And it was obviously Venom. As you saw, he was a bit rushed by the end of Spider-Man 3, and he was kind of just thrown in there fortuitously by some chance. And that irritated me because it was a very discrediting thing to the character. It just felt like a pseudo perversion from what the character really is. Mainly because the actor didn't portray him correctly, in my opinion. Also, the fact that you could obviously see, it was quite conspicuous that they rushed him in there into the film by like the final act, as he was just thrown in there just to be some sort of accomplice for Sandman, just try to take down Spider-Man. But and there's a plethora of other things wrong with Spider-Man 3. I mean, you know, the whole emo, goth, edgy Spider-Man with the hair down like that and everything. So I won't get into that, but that is in due part for Sony executives' parts, and mainly Avi Arad, who was very involved and affiliated himself with anything Spider-Man merch. I'm not kidding. Like, I'm talking about anything. Anything ranging from Spider-Man's 90s animated show, any Spider-Man animated show, Spectacular, Ultimate, I'll get into that in a second. But yeah, anything he stuck his name onto, except for anything comic related. Anything Marvel Comics, he did not affiliate himself with because it's just not his area. You can't really do that. You can't really, advertise yourself in that type of medium. But with TV show and movies, he did do that, and he did do it quite well. Um, so after the failure of Spider-Man 3, Spider-Man 4 was in the works, and this was Raimi's big redemption film, and obviously it was never released, and they rebooted the whole series, but the reason why it wasn't released is because Raimi didn't have confidence in himself. He couldn't meet deadline to finish the script, and it was really disappointing that Sony has to reboot it. And a common misconception here that I'm going to go over is that people think that Spider-Man was owned by Marvel. Like the first three films of the Raimi trilogy, oh yeah, those were by Marvel Studios, right? No. The thing is that Sony had a big deal with Universal and Columbia Pictures, and they just rebooted it. There was no original owner. They still had the rights for the entire 5 films of the Spider-Man franchise. So they rebooted it because Raimi couldn't meet deadline, and that's kind of disappointing. But what's also kind of neat about Spider-Man 4 is that they released storyboard panels, and there's this awesome art. I'm going to throw it up on the screen now. Vulture was going to be an antagonist in the film. You also have Black Cat, who's going to be played by Anne Hathaway, so that was neat. And then, what's kind of funny is that, coincidence, she gone on to play Catwoman in The Dark Knight Rises, so that was pretty neat as well. So, after that, they recently released those storyboard panels, so that was neat. So they rebooted Spider-Man, and the fan base was outraged. They were just in roar because Raimi was such a fantastic director, and it's such a shame that he had to be manipulated and abused, and they had to force Venom in there and kind of destroy the entirety of the film. Because I think the film would be able to sustain itself with Sandman as an antagonist. Of course, it wasn't going to be better than Spider-Man 2 with Doc Ock, because he's one of the more prominent hierarchy exalted Spider-Man antagonists. So after that, they rebooted him, and so they did TASM, and they casted Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone as Gwen Stacy. And another misconception is when TASM was released, the proposition was that fans like to bring up. And when I say proposition about fans, I'm talking about people specifically who don't read the source material, and they kind of just read shit off of Wiki, and they do not know what they're talking about. Specifically be like, holy shit, bro, it's just like Ultimate Spider-Man, holy shit. It's like Bendis' Ultimate Spider-Man and Bagley. Dude, it's ripped straight from the pages. No. Okay, I could see in somewhat of a sense that the way they do the whole Oscorp deal, where all the antagonists come from Oscorp, and that's kind of mundane and monotonous, because if you have all your antagonists having the same background from Oscorp, it kind of takes away from the flavor of what the characters' true backgrounds are from 616 universe. But my gripe is that no, it is absolutely nothing like Ultimate Spider-Man by Bagley and Bendis. Only that little aspect that was shown throughout the narrative in TASM. So that's a big gripe for me. Not only that, but the fact that the character, the way he was written, this was also spearheaded by Mark Webb. I forgot to throw in, but Mark Webb is a kind of romantic comedy / director. He wrote some romance films or directed them. So he was thrown into this. He's not really a big passionate Spider-Man fan that he reads the source material like Raimi, who's a previous director. So the problem is that Spider-Man in this film, at least Peter Parker, is a complete distortion. He is the antithesis of what his original persona is. Now, in the comics, if you read it by any sort of writer or artist, Spider-Man is written in a way where Spider-Man and Peter Parker, they're completely discriminate personas. They're completely the 180 of one another. You have Peter Parker, who's a dubious, docile, nerdy boy who's got insecurities and he's infallible. I mean, he is fallible, and he struggles. And you have Spider-Man, who's the exuberant fantasy hero. He is full of lively energy. He cracks jokes. He's very jocular, witty. So you have that. And the problem with TASM is that this is in part with Andrew Garfield. And the problem with Andrew Garfield is that he doesn't have the complexion of a nerdy, dweebish adolescent teenager. And that's where I really think they went wrong with the casting. And so watching TASM the first time, I winced, and I was just like, it just made me wince out of displeasure because this isn't the complexion. Also, in due part, not only the way Andrew Garfield's complexion, the way he looks, but also the writing. And this isn't in fault with Andrew Garfield's acting. His acting is fine, but the way they write the character in the film, they almost make it seem like Peter Parker and Spider-Man are synonymous in personas, and that's not what you want. That is doomed for failure from Spider-Man enthusiasts such as myself, and fans in general who somewhat have a grasp of knowledge on what the character is and what his persona is. But if you have these people who just watch the films and they don't really understand anything, like the actual persona from source material, their actual characteristics, then they're going to be like, oh, well, I like this Peter Parker more because he's not as loserish as Peter Parker's from Raimi is. And that's just really disappointing because it really strays away, it deviates from what the true meaning, what the true characteristics and traits of Peter Parker and Spider-Man actually are. That being said, Spider-Man in the Mark Webb trilogy is far, I could see in a sense, it's far more superior unanimously between Spider-Man fans. But for me, no, and I'll get into that in a second. But the way he's written is fine. The way Spider-Man is written, he cracks quips and everything. But the problem is we'll get to TASM 2 when his witty humor is taken to such an extremity that it's unnecessary humor, and he's written like almost like a satire cartoon character, and I don't like that. I don't quite like that at all. And it's almost type of like Deadpool. They always relate it to Deadpool. It's like, oh yeah, but Spider-Man's on that same break the fourth wall level of no. And they also exemplified that in The Amazing Spider-Man. That one car thief scene, the carjacking theme, chase scene, where he looks back at the camera and he's just like, nobody seems to grasp the concept of the mask. And he's talking to his audience directly to his audience. That is a huge problem with me, because now it puts me under the impression that the writers write Spider-Man like Deadpool type, witty, extreme, gratuitous humor, and I don't quite like that at all. Spider-Man will joke in the source material back here. He will crack jokes to a certain degree, and then when shit gets serious, he will get serious, just like the situation. You see, in the source material, Spider-Man cracks jokes to compensate from the fear of him zipping around like 100 miles per hour. And it works quite fine because it makes sense. When he first became Spider-Man, he was only 15 years old. So it makes sense if you're flying through the air and you're doing acrobatic shit, flips through the air, and you're dropping from skyscrapers, you would probably want to compensate for your fear and not make it so it's almost like repressing your own fear. And yeah, so that's what he does in the source material, and it works quite well, but it's only to a certain extent. Before innocent lives are at risk, then shit gets real. Now, you could argue, on the other hand, that certain writers have written Spider-Man to such a degree but I'm only focusing on prominent Spider-Man writers